We're going to look at how to understand negatives in rational expressions or fractions. We'll start with a simple example here. The first thing I want to note is that 1/2, the fraction 1/2 equals 0.5 as a decimal. People tend to think a little better when dealing with decimals. You can imagine on a number line where decimals are in relation to each other. It's a little harder to do that with fractions. Okay, so 1/2 equals 0.5 as a decimal. All right, so let's think about what negative 1/2 means when a negative is in front. That literally means negative 0.5, right? Because you carry the negative down, and then 1/2 is 0.5. So negative 1/2 equals negative 0.5. Good. Let's look at what happens when our negative is on the top with the 1. What that means is negative 1 divided by 2, right? Numerator divided by denominator. Negative 1 divided by 2 is negative 0.5. 1 divided by 2 is 0.5, and so negative 1 divided by 2 is negative 0.5, because a negative divided by a positive is a negative, okay? And last, what if the negative's on the bottom of the fraction? 1 over negative 2. Well, that means 1 divided by negative 2. And similar logic, 1 divided by 2, if they were both positive, it would give you positive 0.5. But if positive divided by a negative is a negative. And so what we see is, independent of where the negative is in the fraction, in front, on top, or on bottom, these three numbers are equal. So what we see, so our conclusion is that negative, let's write it this way, negative 1/2, the negative fraction, equals negative 1 over 2, and also equals 1 over negative 2. And so that's true for any fraction. So we have this general conclusion that's a bit more substantial, and you can maybe imagine how it applies in general. If you have a negative fraction, a over b, well, that equals the same thing as negative a divided by b, or a divided by negative b. And so the way I like to describe this is as a floating negative. In a fraction, your negative can float. It can be in the front, it can float up to the top, it can float down to the bottom, okay? Now, typically we don't like the negative onto the bottom, okay? But if you do have a negative on the bottom, you can float it up to the top, or you could float it out to the front. Okay, so let's see some examples of this. Okay, so now I have this rational expression. There's a variable x there, of course, and I want to write this fraction in equivalent ways by floating the negative. And so you can see the negative down here on the bottom. So I have a negative denominator. We typically don't like that. So what we're going to do is we could float the negative to the front. So negative, and then the fraction next to it. So that's an equivalent fraction to the one we started with. I can also float the negative to the top, and this is where you have to be careful. You don't want to write negative x plus 2 over 3. The problem with that is the negative, when you float it to the top, has to apply to the entire numerator. So when you do that, you have to have a negative entire numerator, so you put the whole thing in parentheses over 3. So that is an equivalent fraction. And also, if that's equivalent, then since you have parentheses, you could distribute the negative to get negative x minus 2 over 3. And so you could go directly from here to here by floating to the top and distribute, because it applies to the entire top, okay? So there are three equivalent fractions to the one we started with. Let's try another example where we have variables on the bottom. Okay, so now when I say float the negative, you think of this, right? The problem is, in this case, the negative does not apply to the whole denominator, it just applies to the 2x squared. So what we need to do, and as we've tried to practice, when you have a negative in front of a polynomial, you want to factor it out. You never want that leading term to be negative. So the first thing I'm going to do is rewrite this, and this will be an equivalent fraction. Factor a negative out of the bottom, or -1, same thing, and that leaves a positive 2x squared minus 3x plus 10. And now what you've done is you've extracted the negative from the entire bottom, and now you can float it. Again, we typically don't like the negative on the bottom, so let's move it. We can float it to the front of the entire fraction, so we get a negative fraction. We can float it to the top. Remember to apply it to the entire numerator, so I'd have to put it all in parentheses. Sorry about that. X squared minus 7x plus 2. So applying the negative to the entire numerator, leaving the denominator alone. And we could also distribute the negative on top, giving us negative x squared plus 7x minus 2 all over 2x squared minus 3x plus 10. So that's how you can float the negative when there are multiple terms. Make sure that you either factor it out of all the terms or distribute it to all the terms as you're floating it. All right? And that's how you handle negative fractions.